is a huge question. Well, when one is afraid of escalation, like what are you afraid of? Like we have shown that even if you are marching into the Russian territory, there is not much of escalation because they're just going to, according to their plan, they keep destroying our energy infrastructure. They keep trying to take all our territories. And there is like not some big explosion that they are making right away. So the question is what the world is afraid of. We have already been showing that Russia can be punished, can be fought back, and should be fought back.
Ukraine escalated drone attacks on Russia's central region, hitting residential buildings in 2 cities. In a statement on Telegram, the Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, called on Western allies to come to the country's aid. Let's welcome now the Ukrainian MP, Rudik. Hello to you, Kira.
Hello, John, and thank you so much for having me.
As always, you're welcome, Kira. Tell me, were you in the city last night? And if so, what did you see and hear of this raid?
Oh, that was a terrifying night, right after we had our anniversary of independence over this weekend. So the air raid siren started like 3 a.m. And with some interruptions, today we had like one of the longest air raid sirens since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. So we spent the majority of the day in the bomb shelters, and we have heard many explosions throughout Kyiv, mostly from working of our air defense systems. However, we also know that there were hits throughout Ukraine and that energy objects were targeted and hit. The most concerning and the most terrifying part is that Russia was targeting the hydroelectric plant that is north from Kyiv, and it's located over the dam to the river Dnieper. And if there would be a catastrophe like in the Novokakhovska Dam, it will be really terrifying and with massive destructions. Yes. So we know that Russians are trying to push us closer towards the total blackout. So after the air raid siren started, there were blackouts throughout the city. We did not have energy and water for a long time. And right now, John, we are speaking, I'm using diesel generator to have electricity and internet.
It is quite difficult to imagine, Kira, what it must be like to live under that threat from here, a place like here in London, where we are, as it were, safe and sound. I know you're used to these aerial attacks in Kyiv and other towns and cities in Ukraine. But tell me, Kira, what about the effect of all of this over such a period now on the mood of the Ukrainian people there in Kyiv and elsewhere?
Well, you know, sometimes we think that we have used to going to the bomb shelters or being under constant threat. But the truth is, you cannot get used to that. You cannot get used to waking up in the middle of the night, trying to turn on your washing machine and have your, like, just prepare for another day, right? Or to have children study under the lights of the candle, like in olden days, because we do not have electricity. The truth is, still, we are full of hope. You know, today in the bomb shelter, I didn't see people complaining or like being mean to each other. Everyone was trying to be very helpful. And we were just hoping that whatever target was, that Russians would not be able to hit. And also it was pretty scary because you are thinking about our air defense forces, and if they have enough of the air defense systems to take everything down that's going our way. Yeah. And we really hope that they do. And me as a politician, I'm working on getting them what they need so they would not be facing enemy empty-handed.
Yeah, well, our best wishes as always go out to you. When it comes to the incursion into Russia, into the Kursk region, what sort of effect has that had on the Ukrainian people? Has it made a difference in that way?
Oh, of course, it was very motivating, but not only to us, but I think to many of our allies and partners throughout the world. And I think we were able to destroy this very dangerous illusion that Russia is invincible. They are not. They are not invincible. They can be fought and they can be won over. And this is what we still intend to do. Look, Putin's plan to destroy our energy system did not change since like 2 years ago, right? And they are just going with their plan. But we need to do what is up to us. And we need to make sure we trust in our generals, and they are able to execute on the missions that they find suitable, to make sure that it's not that the Russian people are actually feeling that it's not only you as attacking when you're launching a war, but you will also at some point will feel the punch back, when it will be important for our allies to see that we still have a chance to turn the tide in this war.
Yeah.
And also to work against this idea that all Russians are against the war and it's only Putin's war. Well, we have proven it is not, and we want the whole world to see that.
And I've been looking at reports, Kira, that Kyiv, that Ukraine, you want your NATO friends, your NATO allies, to help you out further by knocking down Russian rockets where they are close to the NATO border. Have you hoped that NATO may make that step, because it would be a significant step?
Well, today there was another crossing of the border to the Polish territory, and we believe that if the attacks will continue, there would be more attacks on the territories of our allies. And this is why it's not only for ourselves, but we are saying, well, if you want to take down the missiles before they reach your territory, it's a good time to do that. Same as with our allowance to hit Russian missiles on the Russian territory. We need the permission from our allies to do that, because it's very hard to hit the missile when it's very close to the ground and close to the hitting, but much easier when it's just at the beginning of its way.
Yeah, it's reported that in the Polish government, your neighbour Poland, ministers are considering that request to knock down Russian rockets where they are at the NATO border. But it would involve, well, pretty in-depth conversations with other NATO partners, and there would be a fear of escalation. But you know that very well.
Of course, but first, it was not the first time when Russian missiles hit the NATO members' borders, right? There were a couple of incidents with Poland, couple of incidents with Moldova and Romania. And again, it will continue. And I think our friends and allies, they know that. So there should be a solution to that. But then there is a huge question. Well, when one is afraid of escalation, like, what are you afraid of? Like, we have shown that even if you are marching into the Russian territory, there is not much of escalation, because they're just going to, according to their plan, they keep destroying our energy infrastructure. They keep trying to take all our territories. And there is like not some big explosion that they are making right away. So the question is what the world is afraid of. We have already been showing that Russia can be punished.
It's mostly attacks on civilian infrastructure, on water supplies, on energy supplies. And it looks as if Russia, and Putin in particular, having been humiliated by Ukraine's occupation of a big chunk of the Kursk region inside Russia, is desperately trying to show that they've still got the initiative in this war.
Yeah, look, now Russia has launched one of its biggest aerial attacks in its ongoing conflict with Ukraine, with energy facilities being the main targets of the assault. At least 6 people have been killed and major power outages have been seen across the country. That is audio taken during the attack. In response, Ukraine have launched their own drone attacks on Russian residential buildings amid their cross-border incursion into Russia's southern Kursk region. In a statement issued on Telegram, the Ukrainian President Zelensky said Russia's attacks targeted critical civilian infrastructures and called for aid from Western allies. Let's speak now to the former ambassador to Ukraine, Leigh Turner. Leigh, a warm welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Hello. How effective has this latest attack been from Russia, and what exactly have they been targeting?
So they've launched what is pretty certain to be the largest bombardment of Ukraine by Russia in the last 2.5 years of this war. The Ukrainians say it was 236 cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and lots of these Iranian Shahed drones attacking cities right across Ukraine. And you're right, Kate, it's mostly attacks on civilian infrastructure, on water supplies, on energy supplies. And it looks as if Russia, and Putin in particular, having been humiliated by Ukraine's occupation of a big chunk of the Kursk region inside Russia is desperately trying to show that they've still got the initiative in this war.
Yeah, look, Volodymyr Zelensky has issued another plea to Western partners to step up their assistance. Will that plea be met?
I think it's there's several things we're talking about here. One is the idea that Western allies themselves should help to shoot down Russian drones and missiles. And Zelensky referred to the help that the US, UK, and France gave to Israel back in April when Iran launched missile and drone attacks on Israel. And France, the UK, and the US got involved in shooting down those missiles. And Zelensky, a good politician, he said, life has the same value everywhere, implying that perhaps we should help with these ones too. The difference, of course, is that the risk of escalation in the Russia-Ukraine war is very great, and we don't want any kind of shooting war between NATO and Russian forces. But the answer is to give the Ukrainians the tools to do the job of defending themselves. We need to give them those weapons, and we need to help them develop their own weapons. There are two very interesting new weapons that Ukraine has developed itself. One is this Neptune cruise missile, and also a brand new thing, something called the Palyanitsa cruise missile. We don't know much about it. I'm glad we don't, because it's a secret new development. But we need to help Ukraine to be able to defend itself, because if Russia wins this war, it will be emboldened to attack again, as it did after the attack of 2014. And moreover, every country around the world that fancies taking a bite out of its neighbors will be emboldened, opening up a kind of Pandora's box of potential global conflict that will cost us far more than supplying arms to Ukraine now.
Yeah, look, Zelensky's called for aviation support, F-16s and air defense systems are what he is asking for. And this attack coming 2 days after Ukraine celebrated its Independence Day. And as you've leaned into there, Leigh, it comes on the back of a pretty embarrassing incursion into Russia, into the Kursk region by Zelensky. I suppose the question now is, will Russia continue to agitate Ukraine? Will it continue to make these, methodical, targeted attacks?
For Vladimir Putin, this is an existential war. If Putin, having launched this war, quite unnecessarily, there was no threat to Russia, not a single Russian had been killed by Ukrainian forces before Russia launched this war in 2014. Having launched this war, Putin has to win it. And so he will be desperate to do anything he can to make sure that Russia wins this. And we've seen, unfortunately, strong advances by Russia in the center of Ukraine, in the Donetsk region, at the same time that Ukraine has been pushing forward in the Kursk area. And I'm afraid the likeliest outcome at the moment looks like a continued war of attrition. What we must never forget, of course, is that although Russia likes to portray itself as being invincible, as being indomitable, as having limitless resources, none of this is true. Russia is running out of weapons, and it's also running out of manpower. There was some interesting statistics came out last week suggesting that the average age of Russian prisoners of war had increased from 32 to 38 years old over the last 2 years. So we mustn't give Russia the benefit of the doubt in terms of assuming that they have to win this war. That's not true at all.
And I wonder how comparable the attacks are by both countries, to the point where both Russia and Ukraine have denied targeting civilians. I mean, is that really the case?
It's a matter of degree. When you have a very intensive war like this going on, unfortunately, some collateral damage or some injuries and deaths of civilians are inevitable. But I think the way that Russia in particular has been running this war, Russia is, of course, the aggressor to begin with, but we have seen repeatedly in places like Mariupol or in Bucha or in other cities that Russia has eventually overrun, they have absolutely destroyed those cities. And we're guessing that the deaths amongst Ukrainian civilians are in excess of 10,000 civilians who've been killed within the last 2 years. I've seen evidence of Ukrainian attacks within Russia also causing civilian deaths, but it's nothing like the same scale. I saw a video today on the BBC of a Ukrainian missile hitting a tall building, I think in Saratov. But this is not a war of annihilation against Russia in the way that Russia's war against Ukraine is exactly that.
Look, really good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your expertise on that. Leigh Turner, who is the former British ambassador to Ukraine and author of Lessons in Diplomacy, Politics.
And what we saw yesterday as well is that the Ukrainians didn't just take this line down. They hit back one of the largest oil refineries inside Russia with drones of their own. And it looks like they were successful in doing so. And we're getting a lot of chatter on the Russian military bloggers who seem to think this was a pretty significant strike, and they think the damage is quite extensive.
Ukrainians are woken up in the early hours of the morning with air raid alerts as Russia targets the country with another wave of strikes. It's a continuation of one of Russia's biggest air attacks on Ukraine in the war so far. We're joined now by Zach Anders, a journalist in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine. Good morning to you, Zach.
Hi, good morning.
Just explain then what has been happening.
Yeah, this was a remarkable morning. We woke up to a massive air alert that lasted for 7 hours, and we saw some of these strikes, heard the rockets flying overhead in a location. At the time, I was staying outside Kyiv in a usually very quiet location. So to hear the rockets flying overhead was a jolt. And we saw a power plant to our southeast by about 50 miles. The smoke plume thousands of feet into the air after the strike, and everyone lost power. The main thing that got everybody very worried, however, was the strike that impacts near the Kyiv Reservoir Dam. That's holding back a massive volume of water, and if that dam was to breach, the Kyiv metro area is square in its sights. There would be thousands that displaced. You don't even want to think about the possibility of who could be killed in a rush of water of that scale. So that was certainly the eye-opening moment. But what as the day went on and we were able to kind of take stock of the attack itself, what ended up being remarkable was that the Ukrainians actually shot down, by their own account, more than 80% of the missiles and drones that were fired. And I've been spending a lot of time in northern Israel, where Hezbollah has been using these same drones, the Iranian-made Shahed drones, and the Israelis have been having a horrible time shooting these drones down. Even though they have the incredible Iron Dome air defenses, these drones have been slipping through and evading their air defenses, and the Israeli casualties to soldiers in northern Israel are greater. There have been more that have been killed by these drones than by anything else. So what we saw yesterday here in Ukraine was remarkable, because the Ukrainians are out there not using traditional air defense systems to shoot these drones down. They have their helicopters up in the air, and their machine gunners on the edge of the helicopter, literally shooting these down like some kind of World War II bomber. It's remarkable to watch this happen.
And I was going to ask, the Russians seem to periodically target power stations, power grids, etc. And how can Ukrainians better protect those installations? But it sounds like that is something that they've got better at doing.
They have, and you would think if you were a war planner, right, in the Russian mindset, and you're trying to just cripple, handicap your enemy and get this over with, because this war has dragged on now for almost 3 years, you would go after things like the energy infrastructure. Well, for a large part, the nuclear power plants, the dams have kind of been off limit, because in certain areas, the Russians are using this electricity that is being generated inside Ukraine. Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is a great example of that. That right there, I mean, we have the world on edge with Europe's largest nuclear power plant under siege daily. The concern about what happens there, I mean, We should probably the international community should be paying more attention to Zaporizhia, because if anything was to happen there, this would be an incredible nuclear disaster. But the Russians have largely stayed back from perhaps advancing with the same strength and pressure that they put onto other areas of the front lines. In large part because they're using some of that electricity in some of the occupied territories and inside Russia as well, pre-war agreements. So the energy infrastructure has been this on the sidelines for the most part, because neither side has wanted to be inflicted with this kind of damage. They can't afford it. And what we saw yesterday as well is that the Ukrainians didn't just take this line down. They hit back one of the largest oil refineries inside Russia with drones of their own. And it looks like they were successful in doing so. And we're getting a lot of chatter on the Russian military bloggers who seem to think this was a pretty significant strike, and they think the damage is quite extensive. So we're in a period now of the conflict where it's been eroding for so long in the front lines. They've been barely moving in certain places, that this slow erosion is going to probably be a dam break moment, a landslide moment at some point. And we're going to see a flurry of activity where perhaps things like this happen, where Russia is targeting this energy infrastructure and trying to really issue some sort of handicap blow.
Just one other issue, of course, and that is an update on what is happening in Kursk, the Ukrainian advance there. Do you know the latest there?
Yeah, we're kind of staged outside of Kursk right now. We are told that for the most part, the movement in the area is good because the Russians have not been hitting very hard inside their own territory. Obviously, there's still a good number of Russian citizens that are still inside there that are now living under Ukrainian occupation. And the question going forward is there going to be any sort of humanitarian effort to move them out? And you know, you would imagine the Russians don't want to hit this area very hard with as many civilians that they still have in the area they didn't have time to evacuate. So that's going to be a major question mark going forward. It's quiet there from what I've been told. I had a colleague who was just there 2 days ago. He said it was surreal because it was just so quiet on the Kursk, on the Russian side, and the Ukrainians are hurrying and building defenses and trying to hold this territory because it's a great card to bring to the negotiating table, of course. But on the Sumy side, on the Ukrainian side of that region, they're getting hit very, very hard. And the regional governor there said over the weekend that there were some 200 strikes. There were 3 dead, 14 wounded. It was a very bad weekend in that region where the Ukrainians are obviously moving a lot of resources and equipment through daily to try and fortify up this Kursk region.
Zach, thank you very much for bringing us up to date. That is Zach Anders. He's a journalist and he's reporting.
The more that Zelensky can demonstrate to normal Russians that they're in a war, that this isn't just some foreign foray, that actually they are directly being affected, whether it's their young men predominantly and women being returned in boxes or without limbs, whether it's people being evacuated from the Kursk region, 150,000 people, they're going to talk as well. And all the sanctions, I think it all starts to pile up and potentially erode support for Putin.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by the former fighter pilot, military analyst and co-host of the Red Matrix podcast, Sean Bell. Sean, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you, James. Always a pleasure to be here.
It's really interesting because when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, the Kursk incursion was in its early phase. You were seriously impressed by the Ukrainian operation, but you were sceptical about how long they'd be able to maintain their position in Kursk. Have you changed your view on that?
No, I don't. I think when we first saw it start, it looked like about 1,000 troops, about 20 tanks, and it looked like just a probing attack, see how far they could go, ideally probably to embarrass and humiliate President Putin. But they managed to roll back the Russian defences pretty quickly. So they capitalised. It now looks likely to have 10,000 troops in that little enclave. It looks like they've blown 3 bridges. If they were planning to go any further, they wouldn't have blown those bridges. So it looks likely they're settling in and digging themselves in. The real surprise is why President Putin doesn't appear to have done anything about it. I think when we discussed before, one of the options was Putin, because he's Mr. Security, he would need to be seen to be dealing with this incursion firmly. I mean, let's be blunt. It's the first time that Russia's been invaded since 1941. So for a man who presents himself as Mr. Security, this is deeply humiliating. So the question is, why has he not reacted so far? And I think what's been interesting, a couple of answers to that. One of them, I come from military where we delegate down. So from our junior non-commissioned ranks, our corporals, our senior non-commissioned ranks, our sergeants, they are empowered to take control in a world of ambiguity. They understand commander's intent. When things happen that are a surprise, they get on and do something about it. Whereas in the Russian military, that's not the way they operate. Any surprises, they look to their boss and say, what do I do now, boss? Their bosses look to their bosses, and it cascades all the way up. In this case, almost certainly to President Putin. And that leads to a sort of strategic paralysis on the front line until the boss, President Putin, decides what to do. I still think there are two options, one of which is to crush the Ukrainians that are there. And that would take battle-hardened troops. Russia would have to move them from the front line. That would ease pressure on the front line, and that's exactly what Ukraine is probably hoping it'll do. The other option, which I think is playing out at the moment, is Russia has fixed 10,000 of Ukraine's best fighters in a portion of Russia. He doesn't have to do anything about it now. He can put a ring of steel around it, deal with that another day. Meanwhile, as a military guy, you're always focused on main effort. And what appears to be Russia's main effort is the special military operation, seize Crimea, the land bridge, and the Donbass. He's done most of that. There's a small area of the Donbass, relatively small, he hasn't yet taken. It looks like Putin is doubling down on that. Pavlovsk, Terezk are the two areas of focus. And that means he's got 10 to 12 weeks this summer before the winter settles in. It becomes much more difficult to fight. And that's what appears to be what Putin is doing at the moment.
And it's interesting as well, he's got his mate Lukashenko in Belarus to assemble some troops on the border with Ukraine in Gomel Oblast of Belarus. So again, that's probably designed to try and divert some Ukrainian troops up there as well?
It could be. I have to say, having been watching this closely for the full scale of the war, you'll recall early on in the war, Russia had positioned troops in Belarus, and there were suggestions that they'd be mounting attacks out of Belarus. And actually using the Belarusian soldiers as part of that attack. The trouble is, Lukashenko is known as the last dictator in Europe. And it was pretty clear at the time that the Belarusian military said, this is not our war. We're not going to follow you in there. And if you do, that would cause all sorts of unrest and potentially lead to the end of Lukashenko. So I suspect Ukraine has discounted that as a serious threat. What Lukashenko is probably trying to do is he wants to be a buddy to President Putin. He wants to demonstrate that he's doing all he can by putting troops at the border. It just puts a little bubble of doubt in President Zelensky's mind. He's probably got to do something with his resources just to cover off that risk, even though it's very unlikely those troops would actually come in.
And Putin, of course, hates to feel impotent ever. Does that explain what we've seen in recent days with these large-scale drone and missile attacks on towns and cities across Ukraine? Because he's so far unable to drive Ukraine out of Kursk. What can he do? He can launch this bombardment.
It could be, James, and that's very definitely one of the explanations for it. It could be a sort of act of petulance. I can't do this. I'll do something over here. I have to say that what Putin's done very effectively over the last few months, he's got very few long-range missiles left. He's buying them from North Korea and from Iran, and his defense industrial base is spinning up. So he can't afford to waste the missiles he has. So even an act of petulance, I'm not sure he'd do that. I think what's more likely, he does appear to be very focused on the energy infrastructure in Ukraine. Now, in the previous 2 autumns, that's exactly what Russia's done, because it's fearsomely cold in Ukraine over the winter, make life thoroughly miserable for Ukrainians and potentially therefore undermine their spirit, their will to fight. This is a bit early for that. What almost certainly this is about is that Ukraine has famously said it wants to deliver 1 million drones out of its own defense industrial base each year. and they are producing some very effective drones. They are having an impact in Russia, and as a result, it looks likely that Putin's stepping up the attack on the energy infrastructure, because if you take away the power, then the factories can't work, and if the factories can't work, they can't deliver this battle-winning equipment to Ukraine. So whilst it might be an act of frustration from President Putin, and I've no doubt that is a factor in this, the way he's conducting the attack does appear to be coherent with a continued effort to undermine the defence industrial base of Ukraine.
And President Zelensky has promised a response in turn. What do you think that could be? Could that be further drone attacks on Moscow? I mean, we've seen them in recent weeks. That would fit in with the wider strategy of trying to take the war to Russia.
It could be, James, but I think what President Zelensky's got to be very careful to do is to play this on his own terms. Classically, Russia is the larger combatant here. They've got more resources available, got greater wealth available, a bigger defense industrial base, more soldiers. So if Ukraine was simply to meet Russia on the battlefields of old and slug it out, Russia would win. So Ukraine has to find innovative ways to fight the battle. And that's what they're doing with this incursion. It's militarily, it doesn't actually make a great deal of sense because you're diverting troops away from the main effort. Why would you do that? Politically, it plays to the center of gravity of President Putin. Centers of gravity being things that the one of the combatants just doesn't want to lose. And if Putin knows he's actually put in power by the oligarchs, the power base, if they think there's any chance of this war being lost, they are not currently able to holiday in Paris. They're not able to go across to London. There's all sorts of sanctions crippling their business, and Putin is now indicted by the International Criminal Court. The more that Zelensky can demonstrate to normal Russians that they're in a war, that this isn't just some foreign foray, that actually they are directly being affected, whether it's their young men predominantly and women being returned in boxes or without limbs, whether it's people being evacuated from the Kursk region, 150,000 people, they're going to talk as well. And all the sanctions, I think it all starts to pile up and potentially erode support for Putin.
Well, let's pick up on that. How would you assess the strength of his position domestically currently?
It's a very, very good question, James, and I'm impossibly ill-equipped to answer that. I think what we have seen in history is that dictatorial leaders get very, very swiftly replaced. It doesn't end well generally for dictatorial leaders. I think we saw with Yevgeny Prigozhin, who rode a tide, it felt, of public opinion that managed to get him further to Moscow than many would have expected. Putin will be worried about that. It's very difficult when Putin controls all the information, and largely for domestic Russians, it's a bit like in this country, you might have strong political views, but frankly, as long as it doesn't affect what you do each day, you get up, look after your kids, go down the pub, you don't really mind who's in power. Likewise in Russia, they'll believe whatever they're fed as long as they can get on with their lives, bring up their families in some sort of security. But over time, gradually, the narrative that Putin's coming out with does not connect with the number of people coming back in body bags that they're having to bury. Everybody will know somebody in a body bag. By way of context, in the Afghanistan war in the UK, only a few hundred were killed, several thousand were badly injured. But Help for Heroes created a huge bow wave across the country of sympathy for our servicemen and women. Just imagine multiplying that by 100, maybe 1,000. That's the impact this is having in domestic Russia. So all of this is gradually nibbling away at Putin's power base. When will it crumble? Who knows? But history shows these are often short, sharp shocks rather than through a process of osmosis.
That's a really good point. And you've also got the issue of not just people coming home in body bags, but also people being displaced from their homes and being evacuated in Belgorod and in Kursk as well. If you were General Siersky then, if you were the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's forces, what would you do now? Would you try and consolidate the land you've taken in Kursk? Or would you, in a few weeks' time or whenever, try and stage a tactical withdrawal?
Yeah, and that's a big question, isn't it? The problem with answering that question, James, is that you have to set that into the context of that's a tactical issue in a whole strategy for the country. If you look at it from a grand strategic perspective, the Ukrainian counteroffensive penciled in for last year didn't really work. Lots of Western support didn't work. This year, the much vaunted $60 billion of US aid that was meant to come in didn't. That left a hole. Russia got on the front foot. And bluntly, it was always going to be a very difficult summer for Ukraine. And that is where we stand at the moment. Ukraine is on the back foot. Russia is grinding forward. Yes, there's the Kursk intrusion. Yes, there are oil refineries in flames. They've been having effect inside Russia. But bluntly, where it matters on the front line, Ukraine have been struggling. I think Zelensky would be very keen to stabilize the front line, get to winter, and try then to consolidate and actually get back on the front foot again. I think what's been interesting, many of the briefings I get from defense officials and colleagues in Ukraine, is that neither side really has the capability for a decisive breakthrough this year. Russia bluntly has been losing at times up to 1,600 servicemen a day. Compare that with the battles of last year, Bakhmut particularly. Well, that was less than 1,000 a day, and that was described as the most brutal battle since World War II. So 1,600 a day is far more. And even now, Russia is losing over 1,000 a day. Why does that matter? Well, Russia does not want to mobilize again. That would have a profound implication for Putin's power base. He has been trying to recruit people from overseas with a big bounty and lots of money salary-wise. Initially, that worked, but a lot of them were sent straight to the front line and got killed. Funny old thing, far significantly fewer are now recruiting, less than 1,000 a day. So Russia is not sustainable position in terms of manpower. Neither is Ukraine. Both sides are grinding themselves to a bit of a stalemate this year. And in the absence of any breakthrough, I suspect it'll be winter when everybody will have a little catch their breath. Unfortunately, that times with the US presidential elections. And if President Trump arrives, then I suspect President Putin will be rubbing his hands in glee to see if there's some sort of deal to be done.
I suppose on the manpower thing, there's a couple of things to note. First of all, not that it affects the numbers, but there has been a pretty transformative effect to Ukrainian morale with the Kursk incursion. It's given them hope again. And also, a lot of the people fighting, being captured, being killed on the Russian side in Kursk are conscripts, because you can't send conscripts overseas. And whereas there are ex-prisoners, convicts, and migrants dying on the front line in Ukraine, when you've got conscripts who are very often the sons of middle-class families in Moscow and St. Petersburg dying, that changes the political equation. And then if Putin decides, well, maybe in order to solve my manpower problems, I'm looking at another mobilization, you can see the logic in that, but that also carries massive political risk, Sean.
You're absolutely right, James. I mean, you're absolutely right about the morale piece. The Kursk incursion, undoubtedly, not just for the frontline troops, but fellow Ukrainians. I was speaking to one Ukrainian journalist last week, and they said, somewhat with tongue in cheek, I can't wait to see a Ukrainian flag planted in Moscow. Now, of course, probably more in hope than expectation, but I wouldn't underestimate that it's been an incredibly difficult year, and therefore things like that have a huge morale fill up. But I do wonder militarily, I think, as you say, there's two sides to the Kursk invasion. From a military perspective, Ukraine has said they don't want to hold the ground, and actually they can't afford to lose 10,000 troops and all the equipment that comes with it. That will be a significant chunk of capability. So either you're planning to go further, you create longer logistics tails, and that's very difficult to support and much easier for Russia to attack. Unlikely to do that. You could hold your ground, because the longer you're there, the more embarrassing it is for President Putin. Or, as you say, at some stage, you withdraw, and President Putin then looks across the rest of the border, over 1,000 miles of border between Russia and Ukraine, and goes, where are they going to strike next? And it's really interesting maths then. Even if you put one troop every 6 feet, which is a pretty sparsely populated, that's 1,000 troops a mile. That's a million troops required just to protect the border, and that's only one every 6 feet. That isn't going to protect the border. So the implications for Russia to provide robust border security far outweigh Putin's ability to actually provide it. So what it has done with Ukraine's attack is it's sown a seed of doubt. Unfortunately, I think historians are going to look back on this period and write some interesting books about the strategy. Was it folly? by President Zelensky, or was it a masterstroke that helped bring down Putin? Difficult to assess today. Be fascinating to look back at this period.
And do you think, Sean, we will see at some point further cross-border raids by Ukraine into Russia?
I think it's inevitable. I do think that, in fact, I'd be quite surprised if they're not happening already. There's been some articles appeared over the last 48 hours about special operations executives, the name that was given in World War II to areas that were occupied, where resistance fighters operated both within Ukraine, occupied Ukraine, and also in Russia. I suspect there's a continued theme here of making life as unpleasant as possible for Russia. And of course, once Russia realizes that it can't protect its borders, that has strategic. I mean, the number one priority of any political master is to protect your people. If you can't do that, real questions start to get asked. Why are we in Ukraine? All of a sudden, more and more people are talking, more and more dissent. That is very difficult for Putin to manage. We're not there yet. I'm not suggesting there's going to be a big coup, but I am suggesting it's just consistently undermining President Putin's position. And that'll be something that I suspect President Zelensky will be doing all he can. It's an asymmetric tactic. It plays to his strengths. I suspect we're going to see more of it.
And just finally, Sean, what do you think the appropriate response from the West should be? I mean, I'm increasingly of the view that one of the objectives of this incursion actually is to send a message from Ukraine to its Western allies of, look, we can physically invade Russia, and the worst case scenario of some drastic escalation and, God forbid, the use of tactical nuclear weapons by Putin in Ukraine won't come to pass. It hasn't come to pass so far. We don't want to be complacent, of course, but do you think that's part of the objective here? And if so, how should the West respond?
Once again, James, it could be. I think we've got to be quite careful, though, just because, Russia is a vast country. Although Ukraine has made an incursion, the area of ground it's taken is 0.003% of Russian territory. So in grand strategic terms, it's tiny. It's not got any significant capability there, towns, cities, or whatever. So a lot of communities. So I'm not trying to underplay it, but it's not difficult terrain to take. And therefore, did they have to fight fierce battles to get in there? No. Did they have the element of surprise to take it? Yes. Is it an embarrassment for Putin? Yes. But I'm not sure that there are any big military lessons to learn from that at all. I think what's been interesting is that it has raised the question of these long-range missiles. You'll know that for the course of the war up to now, the West has been leaning forward, particularly the UK, in providing weapons. First of all, anti-tank weapons, then tanks, then long-range weapons, and then maybe we weren't providing F-16s. We've certainly provided a lot of the training for tens of thousands of the soldiers as well. And largely we've said to President Zelensky, once you've got it, as long as it's used within the limits of law of armed conflict, we don't mind how you use it. And in a way, Storm Shadow was the same. The trouble is now that Ukraine is operating within Russian territory. And the caveat there is that Putin always said, nuclear is the option if my territory is ever invaded. So Zelensky is calling that bluff, and that's a dangerous bluff to call. As soon as, my understanding is the US, as a leader in NATO, turned around to its fellow NATO colleagues and went, look, I know we're all doing our own thing supporting Ukraine, but actually, if we play into Putin's narrative that this isn't a war between Russia and Ukraine, it's actually a war between Russia and the West, or Russia and NATO, use of long-range weapons could tip that fine balance. So rather than individual nations making a decision, do you think it's prudent that we all sit down together and agree a policy? And that appears to be what's happened with those long-range missiles. I was doing an interview with a Ukrainian news, and they were saying, surely you should be more robust. And I said, be careful how you criticise. The UK is in a difficult position financially, domestically, but it's still providing a lot of support for Ukraine. We must be careful not to escalate this. It doesn't sound as if the West was expecting this incursion. We've got to be really careful not to play into Putin's hand. But so far, exactly as you described it, Putin's been saber rattling every step of the way, but it's starting to sound like crying wolf. But when you get so close to operating inside Russia, I think inevitably, internationally, it's prudent to tread carefully.
Putin clearly was flustered by this, and they had a number of shows of him talking to his senior security people and so on, and he clearly wasn't in a good mood. The awkward thing for Russia, this is relevant because the way people talk about dangers of escalation and so on, is he needs to play this down. I mean, the more he talks it up and then finds it difficult to deal with, the more it does seem like a Ukrainian victory.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by the highly respected historian and academic Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. He's also the author of Command, The Politics of Military Operations from Korea to Ukraine, and you can read his Substack, which is called Comment is Freed. Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, welcome to Frontline.
Hi.
First of all, I wonder if you can just give us your assessment of the past few weeks, specifically the incursion into Kursk. Here we are, almost 3 weeks into the offensive. What is your analysis of it?
So I think what's happened is that Ukraine was in quite a difficult position at the start of end of July, start of August. It had been on the defensive all year. The Russians were pushing quite hard into Donetsk, which is one of the provinces of Ukraine that the Russians claim for themselves. And though they inflicted terrible casualties on the Russians, it was tough for them too, and they were being pushed back. And it was very hard to see how they could take any initiatives of their own, possibly until next year. They needed to replenish their army and so on. And then out of the blue, really, most people were quite surprised by this. On the 6th of August, they launched an attack into Russia, into Kursk. And this got the Russians by surprise, got the Americans by surprise, got a lot of Ukrainians by surprise. They've kept this going now for 3 weeks. They've taken a substantial chunk of territory. They're still expanding pretty slowly now. And though the Russians are starting to fight back, it's going to take quite a long time before the Russians can muster the force and organize it to push them out. Meanwhile, the Russians haven't stopped where they're strong, and indeed their advance has picked up pace. So the war is rather curiously poised at the moment. You've got a very strong push by the Russians, which may see some success quite soon. But you've also got this new initiative by the Ukrainians, which complicates Russian strategy enormously, because it's embarrassing for Putin to have Ukrainians occupying a bit of Russia. Meanwhile, you've also got attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, really severe ones on Monday and Tuesday, and Ukraine is fighting back by hitting Russian oil. So there's a lot of tit for tat going on at the moment. Nobody quite in a position to move towards a victory, but a lot of damage and destruction.
Are you clear what the primary objective from a Ukrainian point of view was with the incursion? Was it designed to divert Russian troops? Was it designed to humiliate Putin? Or was it primarily designed to send a message to Ukraine's Western allies of, look, we can physically invade Russia, and all of Putin's talk about red lines will be shown to be a bluff?
I think all of those things. It was, I think, partly morale sounds like it's not a very good reason, but actually it's not unimportant. They had to show that they could do something, and just to relieve the pressure. Secondly, and President Zelensky talked about this yesterday, he wants to create a buffer of some sort. There's an issue about whether the Ukrainians feared another Russian invasion coming through either Kharkiv or Sumy. They tried one in Kharkiv a few months ago, which didn't actually go very well. But the Ukrainians now say they want a buffer of some sort to make those sort of incursions harder. I think they really do want the Russians to move troops out of Ukraine, and some have already moved out of Ukraine. But fortunately for the Ukrainians, not quite the ones that they would wish, the ones carrying on the main offensive at the moment. So I think there were a number of reasons why they wanted to do it. They also, again, this is not minor, they've taken 500 to 600 prisoners, and many of them conscripts, and they've already swapped well over 100 of those for Ukrainian prisoners. So they call it their exchange fund. You don't get much out of the Russians unless you've got something to offer in return.
And you mentioned that, and it is worth noting, for all the morale boost of the Kursk incursion, that Russia are still making incremental gains in Donetsk around Pokrovsk. And I think that is important to note, isn't it?
Yes, and it's serious. I mean, it's not. Now, Zelensky said yesterday not that they can stop the Russians advancing more, even into Pokrovsk, which is the target city, but that they can't take all of Donetsk. So he's sort of raised the bar a bit for the Russians in terms of what constitutes a victory. I mean, there's a question as to whether Ukraine would have been able to get in the people that have attacked Kursk into positions to do too much about Donetsk, just simply because of the problems of moving people into positions. The thing about this battlefield is every movement is watched. It's very hard to do very much surreptitiously. Even the movement into Kursk was sort of hidden a bit because the best explanation, I think, for the Russians was that this was another defensive move by Ukrainians. They didn't just expect the Ukrainians would have the nerve to try what they tried. But if you know what they do, what a unit is doing, and you've got drones all over the place, and they soon become pretty vulnerable.
I heard an analyst say the other day that the Kursk incursion has sort of shown two different military philosophies almost butting heads. You've got General Syrskyi deploying, in essence, a kind of maneuver warfare with the Kursk incursion, and you've got Russia still, with its incremental gains, going for attritional warfare on the front line in Ukraine. Do you agree with that?
To a point. I mean, I think both the senior Russian and Ukrainian commanders were products of the Soviet system. Ukraine just doesn't have the manpower to do it like Russia. I mean, Russia's tactics are extraordinarily wasteful on human life. They just throw people and fire at the target until it's overwhelmed. The Ukrainians just can't afford to do that. In some places they've tried, and the losses have been heavy. So the Ukrainians do need to maneuver more than just rely on attrition, or at least rely on attrition to the extent that the Russians keep on pouring forward and they can keep on taking them out until the point where they can do maneuver, which is what people were expecting before the Kursk incursion. Maneuver is very difficult, though. I mean, this is what the Ukrainians discovered last summer, 2023, when they tried quite a big offensive towards the south of Ukraine, and they just got pushed back. They just couldn't break through. So again, you come to the problem of the transparent battlefield. That it's much harder to get surprised. What you're doing can be watched all the time, and these days with modern artillery, to some extent aircraft, you can drones as well. You can direct fire very quickly at anything you see. So it's quite hard to do maneuver. This is why I think the Kursk incursion appeared as such an opportunity, because they thought they really could get surprised, and they could see that the defensive lines were very thin. They probably now got almost as far as they're going to go with that for that reason. But they keep on. I mean, the other thing they can do is keep the Russians guessing where they might next try something. So they've reports this morning that they've been pushing in another Russian province, Belgorod. A lot of Russian bloggers are worried that if they move troops away from southern Ukraine, the Ukrainians will try there. So it's hard to do what the Ukrainians want to do. It helps a lot if you can get Russian troops out of the way before you try.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that point about Belgorod and a potential cross-border attack there. I think I read the same report. Certainly, the Institute for the Study of War have been noting it. What is the significance of choosing Belgorod?
only that it's a bordering province. It's from where the Russians mounted an attack earlier this year against Kharkiv, which didn't actually do that well, but it caught the Ukrainians a bit by surprise. So if you want to create buffers, these are the places to do it. I think it's accessible and a way to keep the Russians on their toes. If you don't want them to pour everything either into Donetsk or Kursk, well, give them something else to worry about.
Yeah, and of course parts of Belgorod have already been evacuated as well.
Yeah. The Russians are very jumpy at the moment about this, and this is why it's embarrassing for Putin, because at the very least, given the way that this started, he's not exactly being able to look after his own people. And there's quite a lot of anger in these provinces, which a bit out of the way. They often feel neglected by Moscow anyway. That they're not being protected.
Well, let's focus on Vladimir Putin's position and the Russian response. First of all, has it surprised you, Sir Lawrence, that it's taken a long time for Russia? I mean, we haven't really seen them push back against the Ukrainians in Kursk. Okay, we saw this large-scale drone and missile attack in towns and cities across Ukraine in the past 72 hours or so, but we haven't really seen a major counter-offensive in Kursk. Have you been surprised by the slowness of the Russian response?
It's just difficult. So they have pushed back, and there's been some quite intense battles in some places. And I think the Ukrainians have had mixed fortunes after the first week or so. I mean, they're still pushing on because there's plenty of places for them to push, but not as much as before. So there has been some pushback. The calculation suggests that for a proper counteroffensive, the Russians probably need 50,000 troops available. The Ukrainians were saying yesterday that they reckon about 30,000 troops have been moved out of Ukraine into the area. There's difficulty for Putin to use conscripts, which is also what tends to be available, partly because there tends to be a promise that conscripts won't actually be used in battle, but also they're just not very well trained. So I think that a number of more serious Russian commentators realized from the start that this was going to take weeks, months before they can put it right, which is probably one reason why they're just pressing ahead with what they can do at the moment, on the grounds that if they're stuck with Ukrainians in Russia, they can at least take a bit more of Ukraine.
And let's say Ukraine was able to push further into Belgorod and launch a full-scale incursion akin to what we've seen in Kursk. How politically embarrassing would that be for Putin to have essentially two oblasts occupied?
Yeah, I'd be surprised if they were able to get very far, but it certainly would be embarrassing. And Putin clearly was flustered by this, and they had a number of shows of him talking to his senior security people and so on, and he clearly wasn't in a good mood. The awkward thing for Russia, this is relevant because the way people talk about dangers of escalation and so on, is he needs to play this down. I mean, the more he talks it up and then finds it difficult to deal with, the more it does seem like a Ukrainian victory. So the tendency is to play it down. So this is what happens in war. It's normal. We can cope. We can manage. It's a tiny slither of Russia. We're a massive country, and so on. So that is part of his inclination not to talk up the danger until the point where they can deal with it. Then he'll explain why there's battles going on Russian territory.
And he's in a very difficult situation. I mean, if you take your figure of 50,000 troops needed in order to repel the incursion into Kursk, I mean, where is he going to get those from? You either have to divert from the front line or use conscripts, which, as you've outlined, Lawrence, is very difficult, or a fresh wave of mobilization. But that's politically very risky for him.
It is. And I think that was immediately after the incursion. There was quite a bit of talk about mobilization, which, again, I think got dampened down. The basic problem is there's labour shortages now in Russia. To recruit people, they're offering large amounts of money, and word gets back about what's likely to happen to you if you go to the front line, which isn't good. So they're finding it harder to recruit people, say, voluntarily. There's fewer people that can be sort of press ganged into service. So they can sort of keep it ticking over, but they do have a problem. And there are now the economy is overheating. They're pushing up defence production, so they need workers for the factories as well. Public utilities are suffering. We saw a few months ago a major terrorist attack, which indicated the interior forces are depleted as well. So it's a problem for Putin that the very wasteful approaches they use to fighting their wars mean that they've squandered a lot of their assets.
And on the point about Russia's manpower problems, I mean, we've been talking for years really on Frontline about the Russian casualty rates and, people questioning whether it's sustainable. And there has been this sense, well, it's sustainable because they can just keep chucking people into the meat grinder and they're not so bothered about casualty rates and all that kind of stuff. But of course, something is sustainable until it isn't. And now we've seen this incursion into Kursk. Are we now at that tipping point where actually the chickens are coming home to roost and the casualties are starting to be felt?
I mean, you put it correctly, I think, before. It isn't until it isn't. And I don't think we've got a very good view of the tipping point. The public opinion polling in Russia exists, but how reliable it is questionable. It suggests, the studies of public opinion suggest that it's in decline. The people are fed up. They would like peace. I mean, they would like the war to be over. They're not going to come out and say that Ukraine is a victim and we're at fault. But they'd be keen to see it over. But Putin is in command of the politics of Russia. He's got his own people surrounding him. There's no obvious contenders for power. So even if there's a lot of grumbling and unhappiness, there's not a lot that I think just ordinary people can do about it. I think it's more a question of the cumulative pressures of the war building up, including on the economy, and this may take some time. And, there's a couple of things to watch for. First, if they are successful in Donetsk, seriously successful, will he use that as an opportunity to say, look, we've done pretty well now, this is the moment to strike a deal? What's the relevance of the American election? A month or so ago, I guess he was pretty optimistic that he'd be able to deal with Trump, who I don't think he finds particularly easy to deal with, but at least is somebody who wants to deal with Putin. Harris is a different bet, and no reason why the Harris administration would be any different from the Biden administration and not be willing to reward Russia for its aggression. So I think it's a cumulative process rather than a particular factor which tips over. And it may take some time. I've been very wary about predicting how this war will end for some time. Neither side is winning. The aim at the moment is not to lose, but actually finding a way to win requires political changes in your opponent. And Ukraine, for all its suffering, I think will keep going. Russia keeps going so long as Putin wants it to, and so long as there's no challenge for him to him coming from within Moscow.
And how do you assess the strength of his position in Moscow? I appreciate he has obviously complete control of the political structures there, but he will be a paranoid man and he'll be worried about his position all the time. So do you think that the threat level against him has risen in recent weeks?
Well, he's made a point of keeping loyalists in positions, including at the top of the armed forces, which is why Gerasimov, who really has not had a very good war at all, their commander-in-chief, is still there. And those figures who opposed him coming out of the military conflict, Prigozhin last summer, the head of Wagner, Surovikin, who supported Prigozhin, if only indirectly, and was by far their best and most effective general, is basically been retired now. So he watches that. And then you've got the technocrats. As has been remarked a number of times, he's got lousy generals, but he's got very good economists. And they've really done an impressive job keeping the Russian economy afloat, managing the currency and all these things. But you can see they're feeling pretty tested by it all now as well. So this is why, and you saw yesterday, Zelensky was talking about a theory of victory, which you may think is optimistic, but it was clear he wasn't just relying on military means to achieve it. It's economic, which is why they keep on going for oil depots and refineries. It's political, diplomatic, which is why he had Indian Prime Minister Modi visiting and gave him as big a hug as Modi had given Putin, and so on. It's a whole series of things that add to the pressure. And when this works, if at all, it's very hard for us over here to say.
How should the West treat this moment? Is this now the time for the West to further loosen restrictions on how Western supplied weapons can be used inside Russia?
I think so. And this is a long-running debate, and it's gone through many stages. I think initially the administration was nervous that one way or the other they were going to get drawn into a shooting war with Russia, and that would be very dangerous. And I think most analysts would probably agree with that. That's very dangerous. But you don't, and Putin, when he was actually making his more serious nuclear threats, it was about NATO coming in side by side with Ukraine. Every other red line they've talked about has now been passed. New countries joining NATO, F-16s are now flying in Ukraine. Russian territory is regularly being attacked. Long-range systems have been provided. All of these things have happened, and the war carries on without it turning into the Third World War. And so now we've got this one particular thing of whether or not Ukraine can use the longer range American systems and the British Storm Shadow, French Scalp, that cruise missiles that have American components in them, to attack targets deep in Russia. The Ukrainians want to attack air bases. It's very reasonable, it seems to me, that they should be able to do so. So the pressure is building up on that. Note that the Ukrainians have now got a pretty impressive long-range drone that they're starting to use, and they announced yesterday that they've tested a ballistic missile. In the Soviet days, Ukraine built lots of missiles. It had a big defense industry. So I think that is, over time, the Ukrainians will do it themselves. But it seems to me unfortunate at this stage in the war that the Americans and the Ukrainians aren't wholly in lockstep about what's needed to do to get this war over.
And do you think Zelensky has a point? I mean, I think a lot of Ukrainians are frustrated when they feel as if their allies have been one step behind throughout this entire conflict. That, first they were told you couldn't have tanks, then they got tanks, then they were told you couldn't have F-16s, and they got F-16s. Now they're asking to use longer range missiles inside Russia. My sense is probably the West will move on it, but they might say we could have moved on it a year ago.
Yeah, I think that view is very strongly held. I mean, the Americans now are saying less about worrying about Russian red lines and more whether this is the right priority. It's not masses of the long range systems around. There are useful things to attack. Where the Americans don't mind, the Americans don't care if Crimea is attacked, because although the Russians think Crimea is Russian, the Americans and the Ukrainians don't, and so on, which indicates just this blurring of the boundaries here. So there are questions about priorities, but I think you get around that by having conversations on what makes sense, what it is that you, how the Ukraine can be best supported in what it's trying to do. There's another argument which is a bit retrospective, which is that in practice, this has all been very incremental, and so the Russians at each stage have been confronted with a line that's being crossed but isn't quite worth raising the whole temperature themselves about. It seems a small thing, and then another small thing happens. So it's the incrementalism has made it easier to increase support for Ukraine without getting into a major crisis with Russia. Again, I think there's some truth in that argument, but the fact is that the Ukrainians are paying daily the costs of this war, and so long as the Ukrainians think that they can subjugate the Ukrainians, they'll carry on, and somehow they've got to be disabused of that notion.
And just finally, Sir Lawrence, and this is a almost impossible question to answer, but I just want to invite you to speculate. When the history books are written of the war in Ukraine, how significant do you think the events of August 2024 and this incursion will be?
The war goes through stages, and you can identify the stages by an event such as this. So, September 2022, you had a successful Ukrainian incursion, which led to Russia doubling down, like Putin doubling down on his objectives, led to mobilization. You had the failed offensive last year. You've had a Russian offensive. So it's an important point in the war, and it changed the conversation. So in that sense, it'll be important. If this fails, I mean, if the Russians push on in Donetsk and the Ukrainians get pushed out of Kursk with losses in the process, then people will say it was a bold and audacious move, but a bit mad. If it then managed to establish themselves there and Russia is obliged to take more forces out of Ukraine, it will seem great and a very clever thing to do. But that's an argument that's still quite poised.
So the people that matter the most when it comes to this, I think, are the oligarchs and the other various power centers around the Kremlin that keep Putin in power. At some point, if they believe that there is no way that Russia can win, then they can blame Putin for this. And I think that Ukrainians also are attacking the cracks between the general staff and the FSB and the other services. These guys all hate each other. And so I think, of course, Ukrainians know this. And so I think they are attacking these vulnerabilities as well.
We're hearing reports of Ukraine attempting a second incursion in the Belgorod region. What do you make of this?
Well, first of all, I would not use the word incursion. I think these are all part of a larger Ukrainian counteroffensive. Now, of course, the Ukrainian government and the general staff are not advertising specifically what they're doing or what their specific objectives are. And so we don't know, and we're not entitled to know those kind of specifics. So I can only speculate what it is that they're trying to accomplish. But what started almost 4 weeks ago, this counteroffensive in the Kursk direction, is not, in my mind, a standalone thing. It's part of a broader multi-domain operation that includes not only creating a bridgehead inside of Russia that would push back Russian forces, but it also is within the broader context of Ukrainian long-range strikes against airfields, oil and gas infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. This is a big part of that. And of course, they're still trying to defend Pokrovsk out in the east.
And what do you make of Ukraine's incursion in Kursk? We hear that they're holding around 500 square miles of territory. What would be your latest assessment of this incursion? And what do you think would be Ukraine's next steps?
Well, again, I would not use the word incursion. Incursion sounds kind of like a little small cut or something like that. I would use the phrase or the doctrinal phrase of counteroffensive because of the effect that they're trying to achieve. And what matters is less how many square miles or kilometers they control or how many villages they control. What they're really after is to deny sanctuary to Russian forces that have been launching attacks against Ukrainian cities and civilians. And they're also trying to change the narrative of this conflict, that somehow Russian victory is inevitable. There's no way Ukraine can win, while clearly this counteroffensive is demonstrating that Ukraine has once again been underestimated by us. So I think their target is as much the people inside the Kremlin in terms of how they think to put pressure and create domestic problems for them, but also leaders in the West to show that Ukraine is far from finished.
And what would you say would be its impact on the Russian population? Do you think that that's impacted their perception of Putin?
This is an excellent question, and it's something I've thought about for the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, what does it take for Russian people to finally say that's enough? Now, of course, the leader of the Russian Federation does not have to worry about journalists asking hard questions. He doesn't have to worry about hearings or having to answer questions from the parliament. And he really doesn't have to answer to voters. But that doesn't mean they're not sensitive to what people think about things, which is why I believe they have avoided recruiting troops out of Moscow and St. Petersburg, for example, because they don't want to have funerals in the streets of those two big cities the way they are all over the rest of Russia. Still, Russia is not the kind of place where there's going to be rioting in the streets, protests. Putin has invested a lot of money and effort over the last 20 years to make himself coup-proof. The interior forces and security forces are very strong. So the people that matter the most when it comes to this, I think, are the oligarchs and the other various power centers around the Kremlin that keep Putin in power. At some point, if they believe that there is no way that Russia can win, then they can blame Putin for this. And I think that Ukrainians also are attacking the cracks between the general staff and the FSB and the other services. These guys all hate each other. And so I think, of course, Ukrainians know this. And so I think they're attacking these vulnerabilities as well.
Zelensky says that this operation that he has in Kursk, it's part of a victory plan, which he will present to Biden next month. What do you think is involved within this plan? He's also said that how the success of this plan, it will depend on Biden and what he can give to Ukraine as part of this plan. What does this plan involve, and what does he mean by that?
The most important thing that the President of the United States could do would be to publicly state it is in the best strategic interest of the United States that Ukraine wins, that Ukraine defeats Russia and pushes them back to the 1991 border. And if that becomes the U.S. strategic objective, then there'll be no more of this nonsense about restrictions on ATACMS or parceling out aid or uncertain deliveries of things. Instead, if we want to win, and that's the objective, then we're going to push everything to Ukraine that they need. And then I think UK and Germany and France and others would feel more confident doing the same thing. So I believe that President Zelensky's victory plan has to convince the American government, the American president and his team that, number one, it's achievable. Number two, that it can be done without leading to World War III or some sort of Russian escalation. And also, what I hope President Zelensky will do is convince the American president that the collapse, if Putin's regime collapses, that's not a terrible thing. That nothing terrible happened after the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of the Cold War. So I think there's an excessive fear in Washington about, oh my God, the regime might collapse. Okay, well let's plan for that. Let's not do things to stop it. I think that's what President Zelensky's going to try to do.
Zelensky, he also said that Ukraine's recently carried out a successful test of a ballistic missile. So these missiles, they're domestically produced. What would be the significance of these missiles in Ukraine's war effort?
Three things. Number one, they become much less dependent on others for help on these kind of capabilities. And obviously help from the US and the UK and Germany and France comes with the caveats. So this would help Ukraine break free of those kinds of caveats. The second thing is that it would give Ukraine the ability to kill the Archer. You know, when we're talking about air and missile defense, it is much better to kill the Archer than it is to try and intercept all of the arrows. So if you can strike the bases from which these strikes are coming, the Russian Air Force taking off at bases deep inside of Russia, if you can hit them while they're still on the ground, then it's going to be much more effective than trying to intercept 100, 150, 200 missiles and drones every night. And then the third thing that it will do, it will put more and more of the critical oil and gas infrastructure within reach, and that really will cause problems for the Russians when they are no longer able to export oil and gas, which is what pays for their war effort. And then also Russian people will begin to feel the effect, and they'll take notice.
Do we have any knowledge as to the scale and production of these missiles by Ukraine? Do we know the speed at which they are potentially producing these missiles and when they can come into effect in terms of, the situation on the ground?
I certainly do not, but I'd be willing to bet it's more and faster than what most people would think. I mean, we have consistently underestimated Ukrainian capability, Ukrainian innovation, and Ukrainian will. We consistently underestimate it and consistently overestimate Russia's will and capability. And I think this will be another case of that. Remember, Ukraine was the heart of the defense industry of the Soviet Union when Ukraine was still inside the USSR. So you have a lot of engineering and technical expertise there still in Ukraine. So it would not surprise me that they are developing this kind of capability.
We've also heard from Zelensky that Ukraine's used some of the newly arrived F-16 fighter jets that were sent by Western countries. What do you make of this?
If you compare Russia's economy to the combined economies of the West, we dwarf Russia. Russia's economy is about the size of Spain, with all due respect to our Spanish ally. So if the West got together, the resources available to Ukraine would be endless. The problem is we have not demonstrated the political will to do that. Still, providing things like F-16s, obviously that's important. I'm reluctant to say it's a turning point. You never know you're at a turning point until it's well behind you, and then you can look back and say, "Aha, that's when it happened." There's no downsides to getting F-16s, but we should be clear that the numbers are still small. The Ukrainians, I think, are going to become very proficient very quickly as they build up experience. And of course it will help. It's already helping, it looks like, in their air defense, being able to knock down some missiles. That by itself is not going to change the outcome of the war. Not yet. There is no one system that completely changes everything. It's how these things are employed. I anticipate that the Ukrainians will be very clever and effective at protecting their bases from which they fly and where they support these aircraft. The maintenance required to keep them in the air. It's a system, and I'm pretty sure that they're going to do better than people might have expected. But there is no one thing that changes everything.
In terms of looking at Russia's military resources themselves, one of the suggestions about the operation in Kursk was that it would help to redeploy Russia's efforts in terms of military and then also resources to that region to take them away from the operations in Ukraine. How do we see that situation looking at the moment?
I think we're only just now starting to see reports of some Russian troops that are being redeployed from other areas towards the Kursk bridgehead to help Russian forces address this. Now, it's taken several weeks to get to this point. Part of that I would attribute to the Russians being caught by surprise and not being prepared to deal with something like this. Part of their problem for being slow and incoherent in their response goes back to this hatred and rivalry between all the different services. The general staff is in no hurry to help the FSB here. And then even in the best of circumstances, the intelligence sharing, the logistics, moving things around is going to be a challenge. It's made worse so because of this very fraught command and control system that they have in place. And then finally, the distances. I mean, even the Russians, who are famous for moving a lot of stuff real far, real fast, if you weren't prepared for it, didn't anticipate the requirement to have hundreds of rail cars and hundreds of trucks standing by to move several thousand troops and all their kit and ammunition, etc., from in the east all the way around to Kursk. I mean, that's going to take some time. And I think the last thing I'd offer on this is for Putin, it's much more important to him, I think, that he be seen as, or that they capture what they think is important in the Donbass, and that Kursk, if he can ignore it or turn it over to FSB and let him treat it as some terrorist operation, versus having to explain to everybody around him that the Ukrainians have launched a massive counteroffensive into Russia. So I think he's hoping that he can solve these two different problems in different ways. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think the Ukrainians are planning to stay there for several more weeks, and it is possible that at some point the Russians will finally have to say they need more capability brought around.
Finally, we heard from the British Prime Minister today, as well as the German Chancellor, that they will continue to financially, economically, politically, and militarily support Ukraine for as long as necessary. But yesterday we heard from Sir Keir Starmer. He didn't answer whether the UK will allow Ukraine to use long-range Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia. What did you make of that?
Well, this is unfortunate, but I would put, I mean, UK is a sovereign country, so the Prime Minister should be able to do whatever he thinks is best. But I think there probably is some technical aspect to Storm Shadow that gives the U.S. The authority, and this is not uncommon, that the U.S. could say, well, you cannot give Storm Shadow to Ukraine to be used in this particular situation. So here, I would blame my own government. Again, this goes back to a failure to make it clear that our objective is for Ukraine to win. And if you don't have a clearly defined objective, you end up with a lot of bad policy. And this is one of those bad policies where we're putting restrictions on Ukrainians against striking targets inside Russia, particularly those airfields, while airplanes are taking off from those airfields that are murdering innocent Ukrainian civilians. I don't know how the hell my government, your government, the German government can just sort of say, well, we don't want to have an escalation. And the Russians are laughing at us. I mean, they launched 200 missiles and drones in the last 48 hours aimed at civilian targets. I don't understand this absolute lack of moral courage and strategic back.
Being Putin, he always sticks with the old team. He's stuck with Gerasimov. Yep. And he's, even put his former bodyguard in charge of the counter operations in Kursk, Damyan and Alexei. And they got to such a state that within days of him announcing that, he said, oh, no. After all, it's going to be run by a committee of 4, the defense of the Kursk pocket. And the troops are not mainstream troops. By and large, they're FSB, former KGB, in other words, security force troops, and Roskadia, National Guard Gendarmerie. So there's something that really isn't working there.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we are joined by a defence editor with 55 years experience as a broadcaster and journalist. Robert Fox has reported from several conflicts, including the Falklands, the First Gulf War and the Balkans. He's worked for the BBC, the Daily Telegraph and authored many books. He is now the Evening Standard's defence editor. Robert Fox, welcome back. Great to see you again.
Yes.
With just over 3 weeks distance from the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk Oblast in Russia, what is your assessment of the Ukrainian strategy, what it's achieved and how effective it is?
Well, the jury's out on this because although both President Zelensky and Colonel General Syrskyi have been making statements to the press rather belatedly, and who can blame them, and they've said it's really to relieve the pressure on the central front. It certainly hasn't done that. But it's certainly doing something because they have shown that Russia, even with its resupplies from Iran, from North Korea, is not winning the drone war. Although it's attacking like mad with these multiple bombardments of infrastructure, dams, the hydro stations, and very much going for the civilian infrastructure, it's not getting through to the extent that it should. If you launch 200 drones and missiles and you're getting up to 80% of them knocked down, something isn't working. I think actually what we're really doing, it is very important. We're waiting for the next stage, which comes quite quickly. It's what goes on in the next 10 days to 3 weeks. And it's the depth battle. It's the battle that supports the bombers, and it's the battle that supports the resupply, both on the central Donetsk, Luhansk front and in the Kursk pocket. And that's where they're having a tough time, the Ukrainians, but they're far from losing.
At the moment, as things stand, today, Thursday, the 29th of August, it's being judged as a very risky but bold but risky move, I should say, by the Commander-in-Chief of Ukraine's armed forces. Why do you think he would do it now?
He's rolled the dice. And remember, it's not only a kinetic war, a war on the ground and a war in the air, it's an information war as well. And this is something that he, and particularly Budanov, the director of intelligence and the director of an awful lot more, including the psychological warfare, and he is really very sophisticated and has learnt the lessons from last year. They're trying to undermine the confidence of Russia at a grand strategic level. They're playing mind games with Vladimir Putin. And that is, from what one gathers, it is having some success. There's a much less confident Putin. He's going all over the place. Let's work on this front and that front. What are we going to do in the Baltic? What are we going to do with Moldova? What are we going to do to upset the elections in Georgia? Watch this space.
It's really interesting because it does seem in response Russia has resumed these intense series of drone and missile attacks on Ukraine, in particular on its energy infrastructure. Why the concentration on this, for example, rather than a pushback to defend inside Russia itself?
This is very difficult because it's still on the offensive. You've got a tale of two offensives, peculiarly at the moment. You've got the Ukrainians going into Russian territory in Kursk, as we've been discussing, and we've got the push forward around Pokrovka, that at the Chavy Yar axis, to push to these hubs, which do control a big logistics junctions. They're working on that. But they're using old tactics. They're using heavy metal. They're using a lot of infantry, and there's a lot of controversy, which the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian psychological warfare is playing on very heavily, that they're bringing up conscripts and getting conscripts to sign on as trained soldiers, which they are far from, because this is absolutely clear. They understand this, and they will work on it, the Ukrainians. Putin does not want to have a general mobilization, a general declaration of martial law. It's a military dictatorship anyway in Russia, but he doesn't want to state the blindingly obvious, because if he states the blindingly obvious, and our friend Zakharova, she's the wonderful gobby spokeswoman on foreign affairs, on public national media, if they have to say, well, we are at war now and we need a mass mobilization, well, what the hell have you been doing for the last 2.5 years? It hasn't been going so well. I think that that's the message that the Ukrainians are very keen to get through. It's not going so well because most of Russia is still not touched by the aspect that they're in a messy situation, which is making their lives worse.
The slow advances towards Pokrovsk in the Donbass continues, and President Zelensky likened that this week to the battle for Bakhmut and said Russia would throw tens of thousands of troops at it should it want to. Do you think that President Putin will do this because he actually needs a battlefield success right now?
He's got to do an audit, and he must be doing it, but one doesn't know who is informing him. You know, what is the value of the commitment of troops there? Really, how good is the ordnance, the logistics, the chain, the defense industrial aspect of it? It's going gangbusters, so much so that currently the Russian economy is assessed at being growing by 3%. But it's an artificial growth. It's based entirely on this ramping up of, 40% of all public funding is going towards defense at the moment. And really, that should produce a war machine which should utterly overwhelm Ukraine, and yet it's not working. Of course, the Russian defense is actually, it's the Weasley West, it's all these wonderful weapons, but in fact, they're not as copious as they're made out to be. So to look at Putin's got to find a winning strategy and a winning team. And being Putin, he always sticks with the old team. He's stuck with Gerasimov. Yep. And he's, even put his former bodyguard in charge of the counter operations in Kursk, Damyan and Alexei. And they got to such a state that within days of him announcing that, he said, oh, no. After all, it's going to be run by a committee of 4, the defense of the Kursk pocket. And the troops are not mainstream troops. By and large, they're FSB, former KGB, in other words, security force troops, and Roskadia, National Guard Gendarmerie. So there's something that really isn't working there.
You write that if fighting continues at this rate till the end of the month, both sides risk running out of steam and resources, pointing what's going on in Donbass, but also what's going on in Kursk Oblast. And you point to splits in the leaderships of Kyiv and Moscow. What are those splits exactly?
Well, the splits are roughly those that I've described. Putin is now, it's actually ready to sort of change the metaphor and make it easier. It's gangsters. It's a gangster war because you get cliques, and you get, even in the Ukrainian forces, this is going on. It's very interesting that even such an august organization that has been copious in its coverage of the Ukrainian war, like The Economist. I'm sorry to single it out, but it has been so important and so dominant in this, and it was all for Colonel General Sirsky, that he was the genius that was seeing everything. They were leaking gossip, The Economist, that Sirsky should be sacked. What is going on there? That in fact, it's very interesting, because I think of the genius of people like Budanov, that how Western media have got involved in the internal mind games of what is going on in this war. And I just have to say this because this is so important on what Sirsky and Budanov see as what went wrong last year. A hell of a lot went wrong. The summer offensive, which cost a lot, didn't come off. And they blame primarily this, that they blabbed, that they briefed the Western Allies leadership, and they leaked to their press, and their press said, oh, the attack is going to come on Kherson from the west of the front. So June the 6th, what happens before it can start? They blow up the Russians blow up the Kharkovka dam. And apart from the nuclear threat, which we should go into, which is enormous, it's the biggest ecological disaster in the area, in the region, since the Chernobyl meltdown of 1986.
Frontline's in-depth coverage of the war in Ukraine is made possible by Times Radio. Please help support our work by downloading the Times Radio app, the link's on screen now, and tuning in through the day to keep up to date with the latest news and thought-provoking discussions. So since you mentioned the influence of the media, I want to just ask you something slightly related to this, which is the charges in France against the Russian-born CEO of the messaging app Telegram. Is that likely to have any impact on the war and the way it's communicated?
Yes, it's thrown another complication into the picture, because he is accused, because of the underground messaging that goes on, that it favors organized crime. Telegram, of that can be smalled out. It favors pornographers, even child traffickers, but it is also the way that Russian dissidents communicate. So if it's upon one thing or the other, but I think that he's been arrested in France or detained in France, and he's under house detention. It's a thing that, particularly that code of law that happens in Italy, that you can do. It's a caution. It's a warning. You're under investigation. It would happen in France anyway, because actually he's a dual citizen of France. But it is one of these things that is actually bigger even than the Ukrainian war, because you see that somebody like Elon Musk has sided with him. You're attacking the freedom of expression on social media. Even Zuckerberg has got involved in this. But what is so worrying, and it's going to be prominent again in the American presidential election, is the lack of quality control on these media, because Musk himself, ally of Telegram, has downgraded media accuracy, probity checks on X, formerly Twitter. So it's a huge ground. I see a lot of it. I know I'm only seeing probably less than a tenth of the battleground, but a very real battleground it is too. And by the way, that when there is a real breakthrough in social media in Russia, I think that's when Putin himself gets in trouble. But remember, thinking of a year ago, the thing that really shook Putin was Prigozhin, was Yevgeny Prigozhin's sort of pantomime coup. But Prigozhin was the master of the troll factory known as the IRA, the Internet Research Agency. So it is right there, and it's absolutely clear. Harris, as well as Trump, have been warned that by the CIA, by the Intelligence Committee of the Senate, that the Russians will be using social media in the election campaign. And it shows you that none of these conflicts, Gaza, the West Bank, Ukraine, what's going on in sub-Saharan Africa, what is going on in Libya, Sudan, and Somalia, they're all connected somewhere.
Let's just return to the situation directly in Ukraine. And in response to the onslaught by the Russian military by drone and missile attacks on Ukraine in recent days, the US has now said it's going to prioritize its air defense exports to Ukraine, surge energy equipment to repair its systems and strengthens the resilience of its energy grid. How effective is this part of the Russian campaign proving in driving Ukrainians from their homes or even out of the country?
What I understand is that, of course, you can't have full air defense cover. When you think Ukraine is roughly the size of France plus half of Germany, it's an enormous territory. It would be the biggest country in Europe, save Russia, but a lot of Russia's bulk is actually in Asia, as you know. It is a very big country, therefore very difficult to defend. And yes, America would say this, but I think the real game that they've also got to match that with is strike into Russia, where I was looking up the figures just this morning again. Now there are hundreds of drones being launched each week into Russia from Ukraine. And if Ukraine can hang on, it's developing its own ballistic missiles, making them themselves. So Britain, America, and France don't have a say-so whether you can use a long-range weapon or not. By the way, I understand that they're being told, now you see me, now you don't, that more or less they're being permitted to use Scalp, better known to us as Storm Shadow, into Russian territory.
So okay. First, a couple of things to unpick there. It's test fired. Ukraine's test fired its own ballistic missile. It's going to be a while potentially, isn't it, before it actually has it? And
never say that about Ukraine. Never say that about Ukraine.
Yeah, that's true.
Look at the innovation. Do you remember the Bayraktar T2, the Whiz Turkish drone? It was completely used very effectively by the Ukrainians in the opening stages of the war back in 22. It was completely out of date, completely outmoded, completely overtaken, even particularly by Ukrainian technology, within months, if not weeks. And they are absolutely they shame a lot of the Western countries, and particularly the British defence industry set up in the adroitness, the astuteness with what they're doing, and particularly down at the front. Ballistic missile next year, don't count on it. I'll bet they'll have a really good go at doing it this year.
Okay, so President Zelensky, and this week we've had repeated requests from the Ukrainians to be able to be used, Storm Shadows, to hit inside, to get that permission to hit inside to Russia. You're saying you think that's tacitly kind of on the cards, right?
Yes, because I think what Zelensky will bang on about, and who could blame him, is getting permission to use the various American equipment like ATACMS. Certainly, they've been using multi-launch rocket system, I would think, in the Kursk battle. So they've been going into Russia. But there is the AGM-158 JASSM, JASSM, which is more powerful than Taurus, the German version, and Storm Shadow. They'd really like to have a bit of a go at that. But what can I just quickly say that I think Zelensky is brilliant at this, because you have to think he's talking a lot about this. Let's work out what he's not talking about. And I think in air defense, they're beginning to get the F-16s really working.
Yeah, and we saw them working, didn't we, to defend Kyiv only in the last few days, in perhaps a small way, but it is starting, and that they were used to counter these drone and missile attacks.
And that's primarily their role. Their role is not deep strike. They're not going to use them, I would think, primarily in a fighter bomber role. The F-16 is amazing plane because it has been, over its history, incredibly versatile, and you can use them for a deep strike, but that would be expensive and it would be risky. What they want them for, I would suspect initially, as air defenders, to bring down the Sukhois coming in and launching standoff weapons. But they've got to go even further back. These heavy bombers, the Tupolovs, that are coming up from bases well to the east of Moscow, which is a sign of some success of the Ukrainians, is that they're forcing the air bases further and further back. I would say, before we talk next, I think watch for a bridge or two more to be dropped. I'll bet they really have a go at the Kerch Bridge again and try and cut off Crimea.
It's going to be a good chat next time, isn't it, Robert? But let's carry on with this time for the moment. So on those attacks on Kyiv, the recent in the last few days, we have also seen the former Ukrainian Minister of Economy posting pictures on X, purportedly showing the Kyiv hydro dam being hit, and the dam holds, but he said if it hadn't, it could actually put a significant portion of Kyiv underwater. Is your assessment the same as that? How serious is this?
Well, I have to be honest. Since the war, I haven't been there and seen that, you have to worry about this thing. The fact that he's put it up, he's sending some kind of signal. But I don't want to do the usual politician's trick of answering a question by asking another. But there are huge infrastructural problems, if I can put it like that, because Mr. Grassi of the IAEA, went to look at the Kursk facility, still technically, well, very much so in Russian hands, but under threat in the war zone. But they're very worried about Zaporizhia as still. We have had Mr. Plokhy, Professor Plokhy, the great Ukrainian historian from Harvard, who's written yet another book, and he thinks the nuclear threat has in no way diminished. He is very worried because of his recording of the whole story of Chernobyl, which of course was ploughed up again in this conflict, even the casual attitude of Russia to nuclear safety. And there are big things. But what I think that as we come up to the meeting of the General Assembly this great season of September, every September, I am concerned that the Western allies are going to be encouraged also by their media to step back. They'll be obsessed by Harris-Trump. Instead of seeing what a good colleague and friend of mine, Francis Tusa, has posed as a question, if by accident, because the fighting is still so intense, we could get ourselves absolutely without seeing it, rather like the Houthi attacks on the international shipping, which was not foreseen at all, we could get ourselves into what Francis calls an Article 5 moment, where by hook or by crook, by mistake or intent, Russia and its allies attack a NATO country. I think it is extremely possible. I am not sure how the West in depth, how well prepared and how well configured it is to meet that.
What kind of scenario do you envisage?
I think it would probably be Baltic. I think it would be with the Baltic states. I think it could be with Kaliningrad, it would be something like that, or something silly, a miscalculation with the use of force by Russia to press their case and their parties and their support in Moldova, because you're very, very much on the NATO doorstep there. Hitherto, Putin has been very careful, despite all the rhetoric, not to provoke a direct attack on or by, with or from a NATO frontline power. And there are NATO front lines, and the NATO front line has got closer to him, which is a terrible mistake, a strategic mistake already that he's made with this war. He got Finland and Sweden into the NATO alliance, virtually turning the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake. It's exactly the same thing that we're seeing in parallel, curiously, with Iran. It is clear that neither Russia wants a full-out confrontation, nor does Iran want, at this stage, a full-out confrontation. But the possibilities of accident, the occasions, the strange mistakes and turns, they proliferate by the day at the moment.
And every time we have these concerns about use of nuclear weapons, for example, you hear from Belarus on this. And interestingly, when you were talking earlier about President Putin's kind of almost scattergun reaction to what's going on in Kursk Oblast, you also have, in conjunction with this, Belarusian troops building up along the border with Ukraine. Is this part of a useful diversion and part of a way of him just trying to work out the way to develop his strategy going forward?
No, it's a man who's absolutely obsessed with tactics to save the moment of the moment, and I think it's symptomatic of no strategy. Because if he is going to commit Lukashenko to the battle and he's done his bit of rhetoric, but not much more, frankly. He hasn't got much of an army, and the Ukrainians have warned them off, and that's where he could trigger an insurgency, an insurrection inside Belarus itself. There is in this, because he had very good ties there, a Prigozhin element. That's where you could get the next Prigozhin mutiny, funnily enough, because there are Wagner forces there, and they're pretty fed up.
It's interesting that you say that it could trigger some kind of insurgency in Belarus, and like literally in the last few hours, we've heard this news about a Shahed drone being shot down over Belarusian airspace, which is Russian. I mean, how's Kremlin going to react to that?
Well, I will bluster, and I would say initially they will ignore it. But what you will have, and I said you have to think of the mind man as well as the thinker and the leader. You have to think of Budanov. If this has shown a weakness, oh boy, the Ukrainians are going to exploit it. They're going to do something with it. And by the way, this is the great thing strategically, if we want to, with Putin, is he's so thin with allies. He's been going round and round. He's tried to call in the Shanghai Conference allies, tried to call in, been visiting the Caucasus, sending overtures to Georgia, but not one of the stans has really stood up to help him in the special military operation, save for the warlords and gangsters from Chechnya, led by the clan of Ramzan Kadyrov. He has very little local sympathy, empathy, support. And the further east you get, which is critical, they say, don't mess with us. We don't want your problem. And China, above all, is saying that. And I think that there's some kind of negotiation diplomacy, a real gambit being launched by Zelensky at the moment. And somehow what the gesture he made at Kharkiv has got something to do with it. But and he knows the one capital which will really decide, will say enough already, because it's damaging what we need to do and the way we see our security and the way we see our position in the world, and you're just a bit player in it, is China. And I think it's when China finally gets fed up with Putin, which I'm pretty sure it really will do, because his position is very Trump-like at the moment. It is getting less and less coherent by the day, and I think that's where I think things will come to a head. I think we will have some kind of negotiating position, and I do get the sense of smell that Zelensky has got could come out of the back of the UN General Assembly, but don't count out diplomacy now.
So, Robert, President Zelensky is linking the Kursk operation to the second peace summit in November and saying it's one of the stages to end the war. We can talk perhaps about his plan to deliver that maybe another time when there's more fleshing out of all of it. But at this stage at the moment, how do you think the most likely way is that the war will end?
I think it will end. It has to, in some kind of political settlement. Whether it can be done with the two principals still on the stage, Zelensky and Putin, is really open to question. But what really has to be examined is the support from the West. With either a Biden 2 or a Harris presidency, there will be less interest in Europe. But it is like the old adage about war. You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And I think a Harris presidency looking to the Pacific, Californian-based, will find that out very, very quickly. The binding of America and Europe is absolutely essential. It will have to be refreshed, renewed, but they will not be able to walk away from the Ukrainian conflict, which is what the Trump rhetoric has been saying up to now. But boy, we are getting a tremendous lesson from the Ukrainian forces, the conduct of their war machine for the reform and restructuring of Western military formations, Western military structures, probably the British more than any of them.
We're currently in a Ukrainian armoured vehicle leaving the city of Sumy and heading towards the Russian border, where we're expected to get an exclusive first-hand glance into the city of Sumy, which the Ukrainians recently captured. The closer you get to the Russian border, the more you see that's destroyed houses, hotels, residential buildings. When I came here previously with a group of soldiers, they told me that it's not artillery or drones that are doing the work here. It's mainly the massive Russian glide bombs that they can launch from well over the border. We just crossed the border into the official territory of the Russian Federation. Now, it's believed the Ukrainians control more than 1,000 square kilometers here and are digging in to prepare for possible Russian counteroffensives in the region. However, the offensive may still expand and more Russian land may fall into Ukrainian hands soon enough.
They've ordered us, along with all the other reporters and civilians, into this bunker right here because they've seen an FPV drone and they're worried that the Russians could see us and hit it with something.
Зараз отримали сигнал, що на місто насувається група ударних безпілотних літальних апаратів і півдронів. Тож ми змушені спуститися в бомбосховище, щоб перечекати.
We've been down here for maybe 15-20 minutes now, which is quite a while. We were expecting to be in and out, but the soldiers are still quite worried about whatever's flying overhead from us. They've been burned with the experiences of these drones, especially in Donbass, where they're absolutely omnipresent in the skies.
Я прошу прощения, я случайно. Я бы даже на здоровую не наступал.
The Russians are a bit worried because they've seen an FPV drone in the air, and that can often be used to correct or spot artillery fire. This is not an uncommon thing in the battlefields in Ukraine and now Russia.
So Russians use a variety of reconnaissance drones. They can spot like movement of soldiers or vehicles or anything basically from 5, 6, 7 kilometers. Once they are flying and and observing what's going on, and once they observe something, that of course the other units like artillery, drones, any other units, they see the feed from the drone in real time. They correct fire. They make decision basically what to use against which number, or like how important is the target. So, and based on that, what can reach the target? Is it artillery? Is it FPV drones? If it's something closer, if it's something more like long distance stuff, they just send that and attack. And they see in real time where the incoming is happening, where explosion happens, so they can correct and adjust to make sure the target is hit. So that's why the drones, if the drones spot us, it is very, very dangerous, because then they know where we are, they can follow us, and once we stop, once we are stationary, they can, anything can happen.
I understand. The sign in the background says Mirny Ludi, which means peaceful people, basically. It's because we're actually at a humanitarian aid shelter for Russian civilians who, they seem to have everything they need, but they look very stressed, they look very tired, they look very sad. They're mostly elderly people who often do not want to move. A lot of others have been evacuated to the city of Kursk or the wider region as the Ukrainian army continues pushing into the area. We were in their basement for more than an hour, but they have finally given us the green light to jump in and leave, and we're going to be heading back to Sumy and Ukrainian territory as soon as possible.
Continuing to try and stop the Russians in the east hasn't been working. The Russians are making very small advances. It's costing them huge numbers of personnel and equipment. Over 1,000 troops a day being killed or injured, such that they have to be taken off the battlefield. But the Russians are making some small advances. Therefore, to try and dislocate the Russians, to try and get the initiative back, which the Ukrainians have done with the Kursk incursion, they've taken this bold decision. Now, it's not something they'll have planned lightly. It's not something they'll have planned at the spur of the moment. It's something that will have been very carefully planned and worked through. And I remember saying only last week or the week before on Times Radio that I thought the Kursk incursion was phase 1 of more to come from Ukraine. This Belgorod could be the next phase.
Do you think we can draw any parallels from what we saw with the Kursk incursion and potentially how Ukraine might advance with this incursion now?
Well, I think what seems to be happening, and I'm speculating a little here with the lack of information, is that the Ukrainians are going to try and take over a sort of buffer zone inside Russia along its northern border. That will probably equate in a similar size to the amount of territory that the Russians are holding in the east of Ukraine. So that's an interesting maneuver, and that could be what Zelensky's end game is with this, to turn around and say, you've got some of my stuff, I've got some of your stuff. We either agree to keep what we've got, or we agree to give it back again. So it's a very bold move. It's a risky move, but I think very well planned, and it's certainly causing Putin a real headache.
With the Kursk incursion, it was notable how slow Russia was to respond to it. Do you think that perhaps Russia could make the same mistake twice? Are we seeing any evidence of how they are reacting so far?
Well, we're not seeing any evidence. It's very early days with what's going on in Belgorod, and this could be just another raid to dislocate Russian thinking. But and given the fact that Ukrainians attacked into Belgorod twice in the last year, the Russians should be more prepared for an attack into there. If the Ukrainians make significant advances, it shows that the Russians are in a much worse state than we'd even thought beforehand, and I'd even thought a week ago. But it's early days to say exactly what's going to happen. I'll be watching this very closely.
I mean, what would be your analysis of the situation in Kursk at the moment? They've got around 500 square miles of territory. Do we see any advancements there, or do we think that Ukraine's going to start putting their effort into this second incursion?
Well, the Ukrainians have made significant advances in Kursk. They seem to have slowed down over the last couple of days, but that's probably because they're reaching what we call the limit of exploitation, the limit of without thinning out their combat troops too much, without extending the logistic lines of supply too much. And they're putting effort into securing what they've got. And we're seeing this greater control over the same river. That will allow the Ukrainians to trap, and by dropping the bridges across it, they have trapped quite a large number of Russians to the south of that. And by stopping the Russians putting temporary bridging across, they're stopping the reinforcement, and they're stopping them from withdrawing. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see the Ukrainians pushing out to the west inside the Kursk region a little bit more, capturing all that area to the south of the river, expanding what they've got enormously at minimal cost. And the Belgorod could either be a distraction for that, or them deciding to push further out to the east. This is significant, and I think another masterstroke by the Ukrainians.
Ukraine has to find innovative ways to fight the battle, and that's what they're doing with this incursion. It's militarily, it doesn't actually make a great deal of sense, because you're diverting troops away from the main effort. Why would you do that? Politically, it plays to the center of gravity of President Putin. Centers of gravity being things that the one of the combatants just doesn't want to lose. And if Putin knows he's actually put in power by the oligarchs, the power base, if they think there's any chance of this war being lost, they are not currently able to holiday in Paris. They're not able to go across to London. There's all sorts of sanctions crippling their business, and Putin is now indicted by the International Criminal Court. The more that Zelensky can demonstrate to normal Russians that they're in a war, that this isn't just some foreign foray, that actually they are directly being affected, whether it's their young men predominantly and women being returned in boxes or without limbs, whether it's people being evacuated from the Kursk region, 150,000 people, they're going to talk as well. And all the sanctions, I think it all starts to pile up and potentially erode support for Putin.
Well, let's pick up on that. How would you assess the strength of his position domestically currently?
It's a very, very good question, James, and I'm impossibly ill-equipped to answer that. I think what we have seen in history is that dictatorial leaders get very, very swiftly replaced. It doesn't end well generally for dictatorial leaders. I think we saw with Yevgeny Prigozhin, who rode a tide, it felt, of public opinion that managed to get him further to Moscow than many would have expected. Putin will be worried about that. It's very difficult when Putin controls all the information, and largely for domestic Russians, it's a bit like in this country, you might have strong political views, but frankly, as long as it doesn't affect what you do each day, you get up, look after your kids, go down the pub, you don't really mind who's in power. Likewise in Russia, they'll believe whatever they're fed as long as they can get on with their lives, bring up their families in some sort of security. But over time, gradually, the narrative that Putin's coming out with does not connect with the number of people coming back in body bags that they're having to bury. Everybody will know somebody in a body bag. By way of context, in the Afghanistan war in the UK, only a few hundred were killed, several thousand were badly injured. But Help for Heroes created a huge bow wave across the country of sympathy for our servicemen and women. Just imagine multiplying that by 100, maybe 1,000. That's the impact this is having in domestic Russia. So all of this is gradually nibbling away at Putin's power base. When will it crumble? Who knows? But history shows these are often short, sharp shocks rather than through a process of osmosis. But they managed to roll back the Russian defenses pretty quickly. So they capitalized. It now looks likely they have 10,000 troops in that little enclave. It looks like they've blown 3 bridges. If they were planning to go any further, they wouldn't have blown those bridges. So it looks likely they're settling in and digging themselves in. The real surprise is why President Putin doesn't appear to have done anything about it. I think when we discussed before, one of the options was Putin, because he's Mr. Security, he would need to be seen to be dealing with this incursion firmly. I mean, let's be blunt. It's the first time that Russia's been invaded since 1941. So for a man who presents himself as Mr. Security, this is deeply humiliating. So the question is, why has he not reacted so far? And I think what's been interesting, a couple of answers to that. One of them, I come from military where we delegate down. So from our junior non-commissioned ranks, our corporals, our senior non-commissioned ranks, our sergeants, they are empowered to take control in a world of ambiguity. They understand commander's intent. When things happen that are a surprise, they get on and do something about it. Whereas in the Russian military, that's not the way they operate. Any surprises, they look to their boss and say, what do I do now, boss? Their bosses look to their bosses, and it cascades all the way up. In this case, almost certainly to President Putin. And that leads to a sort of strategic paralysis on the front line until the boss, President Putin, decides what to do. I still think there are 2 options, one of which is to crush the Ukrainians that are there. And that would take battle-hardened troops. Russia would have to move them from the front line. That would ease pressure on the front line. And that's exactly what Ukraine is probably hoping it'll do. The other option, which I think is playing out at the moment, is Russia has fixed 10,000 of Ukraine's best fighters in a portion of Russia. He doesn't have to do anything about it now. He can put a ring of steel around it, deal with that another day. Meanwhile, as a military guy, you're always focused on main effort. And what appears to be Russia's main effort is the special military operation, seize Crimea, the land bridge, and the Donbass. He's done most of that. There's a small area of the Donbass, relatively small, he hasn't yet taken. It looks like Putin is doubling down on that. Pavlovsk, Toretsk are the 2 areas of focus. And that means he's got 10 to 12 weeks this summer before the winter settles in. It becomes much more difficult to fight. And that's what appears to be what Putin is doing at the moment.
And it's interesting as well, he's got his mate Lukashenko in Belarus to assemble some troops on the border with Ukraine in Gomel Oblast of Belarus. So again, that's probably designed to try and divert some Ukrainian troops up there as well?
It could be. I have to say, having been watching this closely for the full scale of the war, you'll recall early on in the war, Russia had positioned troops in Belarus, and there were suggestions that they'd be mounting attacks out of Belarus. And actually using the Belarusian soldiers as part of that attack. The trouble is, Lukashenko is known as the last dictator in Europe. And it was pretty clear at the time that the Belarusian military said, this is not our war. We're not going to follow you in there. And if you do, that would cause all sorts of unrest and potentially lead to the end of Lukashenko. So I suspect Ukraine has discounted that as a serious threat. What Lukashenko is probably trying to do is he wants to be a buddy to President Putin. He wants to demonstrate that he's doing all he can by putting troops at the border. It just puts a little bubble of doubt in President Zelensky's mind. He's probably got to do something with his resources just to cover off that risk, even though it's very unlikely those troops would actually come in.
Do you think, Sean, we will see at some point further cross-border raids by Ukraine into Russia?
I think it's inevitable. I do think that, in fact, I'd be quite surprised if they're not happening already. There's been some articles appeared over the last 48 hours about special operations executives, the name that was given in World War II to areas that were occupied, where resistance fighters operated both within Ukraine, occupied Ukraine, and also in Russia. I suspect there's a continued theme here of making life as unpleasant as possible for Russia. And of course, once Russia realizes that it can't protect its borders, that has strategic. The number one priority of any political master is to protect your people. If you can't do that, real questions start to get asked. Why are we in Ukraine? All of a sudden, more and more people are talking, more and more dissent. That is very difficult for Putin to manage. We're not there yet. I'm not suggesting there's going to be a big coup, but I am suggesting it's just consistently undermining President Putin's position. And that'll be something that I suspect President Zelensky will be doing all he can. It's an asymmetric tactic. It plays to his strengths. I suspect we're going to see more of it.
Even before the war, he was getting increasingly isolated. And I guess it all started with COVID, when he famously self-isolated himself in the Kremlin. And sort of 2 years into the pandemic, he wouldn't shake people's hands. He would only meet someone if they themselves had self-isolated for 2 weeks, or if they've been rigorously tested for COVID. So it started with that his circle got very, very close. And apart from children of his allies or his own relatives, we've also seen him elevating people who are not just close to him family-wise, but sort of have been close to his physical body, including bodyguards. For example, there was this recent appointment of a former bodyguard who was a governor just outside Moscow, and he was recently promoted to sort of spearhead the efforts to drive the Ukrainian army from Kursk, which obviously is a very sensitive issue, because this is the first time we have foreign forces on Russian soil since the end of the Second World War. And yeah, you can see that this is a very sensitive task, and he would obviously want to entrust it with someone who he has a lot of trust with, including this deputy. Duman is the name. And not just the incursion of Kursk, but the Wagner mutiny, the mutiny of his former warlord and confidant, to whom he previously outsourced a lot of war in Ukraine, even before the full scale of invasion. He definitely saw it as a betrayal of someone he trusted a lot. So what we're just seeing sort of like recycling of the same people. We're not seeing much of a new blood. For example, if we go back to the defense ministry, the person who succeeded his long-term ally, former Minister Sergei Shoigu, is someone from is a former economic advisor who's been working for him for a long time. So it's sort of about recycling the same old cadre of people all over again, just plucking them from one seat and putting them into another. It pains me to say that, but right now Belarus is not a fully independent country, as we've been seeing since 2020, when the Kremlin threw its weight behind Alexander Lukashenko and basically helped him to secure a re-election in Belarus, despite overwhelming nationwide protests which were about to topple him. Belarus sort of became a vassal of Russia. We see that. There's nothing going on in Belarus without the Kremlin's explicit or implicit orders. And as we saw at the start of the invasion, Belarus served as a springboard for the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. This is how Russian troops were able to get closer to Kyiv, because they were pouring in from the north, from the northern Ukrainian border, from Belarus. And this is where they've been saying troops amassing again. It started with the Belarusian president telling Ukraine off for amassing troops on its side of the border. So Lukashenko is now playing the victim and saying that, there's a threat to our border, so we're going to move troops closer to that. I would say this is not surprising, considering the ongoing Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. Belarus is a Russian puppet as we know it, and this is definitely some sort of a threat that Russia is brandishing out there, sort of showing to Kyiv that if we wanted to invade the Kyiv region again, if we wanted to get somewhat close to Kyiv again, we will do it. Because for most of the war, I would say, after Russian forces pulled back from the Kyiv region in spring 2022, there was hardly any threat to Ukraine from the Belarusian border. So with this, Russia is basically showing to Ukraine that, we could start doing it again, and you're going to have another front unless you pull back from Kursk, or unless you sort of step down into whatever you say. We have seen stories of defections in the Russian forces, not a lot of them to Ukraine. There was this daring escape of a fighter jet pilot who famously hijacked his plane into Ukraine, I believe, in 2023. This one is a member of paratroopers, if I'm not mistaken. He apparently coordinated his defection with Ukrainian forces, so he knew where he was going after that and where he was what he was doing. He filmed himself throwing a grenade into the barracks he was stationed at. I believe it was a basement of some sort. So there's quite an extraordinary video making rounds, a video that shows an explosion of that grenade thrown into the quarters of his commanders. After that, he apparently was able to cross the border into Ukraine. The Ukrainian officials were able to coordinate an escape route with him, and he resurfaced in Kyiv last week and gave a press conference and said that he was very much disillusioned. He's not a conscript. He's a professional soldier. He's someone who's been serving in an army for a while, and as he says, that he didn't go to the army to do just that. He went. He joined the armed forces to defend his country from someone, and as he saw, the Russian army was actually attacking in another country, and this is not something he signed up for. So he was able to defect. I would say my main concern here is his own personal safety, because as some of our readers might remember, that Russian pilot who hijacked the plane into Ukraine, his case was very much publicized in Ukraine and abroad. He was offered an asylum in Spain after that, and a couple of months later, he was found dead in a Spanish home. So definitely there's, I would have a lot of security concerns for that man, because it looks like Russia would be targeting those people. And as we know, Vladimir Putin, he has a thing about treason and traitors. So for him, in a way, this is this cardinal sin, and he would like to see the government to go after those people to show an example that these are the consequences for you if you decide to do that. Look, I mean, defections are happening. They're just not that publicized. And if I were a Russian soldier, I would rather want to do it quietly away from the camera, so that I wouldn't repeat the fate of that Russian pilot who ended up killed in Spain. There's this one Russian charity that has actually been helping Russian soldiers to defect from all over the country, and they are using very creative routes. Some of them lead to Baltic states across northwestern Russia, so it's not that straightforward. Those defections are few. I think we were talking about dozens. I would say a couple of dozens a month from what I've been hearing. But it's been happening, and I would say one of the concerns is communications, because the Russian state is trying to make an example of the defectors that it catches. There's a lot of news going around in Russian media about Russian police catching men who are trying to join the Ukrainian army, who are trying to join Russian fighters fighting alongside Ukraine. And those people are getting caught, they are filmed, they are put on trial, and all of those trials are highly publicized, explicitly with the aim to ward off those defections as much as they can.